Welcome to our McKinley Advisors webinar, Reducing Uncertainty with Scenario Planning. McKinley Advisors is a little over 25 years old. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We also have an office in Chicago, Illinois. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations, trade, professional associations. We have about 45 staff. And over the course of our 25 years have worked with quite a few different types of association clients. Let's meet our speakers for today. Karli, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Shelley. Hi, everyone. I'm Karli Susi. I'm McKinley's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations. I started working with McKinley in 2010 and spent the first half of my career with the firm in a client-facing role, and more recently have been in kind of an internal role focused on our kind of own business operations. So our own business strategy, as well as our talent strategies, finance and accounting, and operations. McLean?
Thank you, Karli. My name is McLean Gift. I'm the Director of Analytics at McKinley. I've been at McKinley for 6 years. And before that, I worked for a large trade association where I contributed to their financial modeling efforts. And since joining McKinley, I have worked on the consulting side and recently have pivoted to also focus more on an internal role where I oversee the implementation of McKinley's analytics service lines.
Great. So before we jump in today, we wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of what to expect over the next 30 minutes or so with us as we walk you through how to go about doing scenario planning within your organization. So the first objective, we want to teach you the process that we use when developing scenarios for our clients. So we do these types of exercises in a number of different settings. So when we're doing business planning projects, or if we're doing portfolio assessments to look at different programs or services or products, there are a number of different applications for this type of process. Today, obviously, we're going to focus on just general business continuity planning in light of COVID-19. But as I mentioned, there are other applications that you could use this type of process for. So we want to teach you what that process looks like from our lens. Second, we want you to understand the ways in which you can use the next couple of weeks when it feels like there is a lot that is outside of your control and outside of your organization's control. We want to give you some short-term steps to kind of make lay some meaningful foundation and lay the groundwork for getting ready to make decisions in the kind of weeks and months ahead. So while it feels like you may kind of be in a sit and wait period right now until the virus runs its course, the economy settles down, any of these other kind of disruptions in our world kind of come to a close, we want to encourage you that there are short-term steps that you can take to set your organization up for success in the long term. And finally, there are likely to be some hard discussions and decisions ahead for you and your leadership team. You maybe have already had to make some of those hard decisions. So we want to give you some tools and strategies to make sure that you're able to bring objectivity to those conversations. The more kind of data and objective process that you can share with your team as you're going through and kind of navigating those really tricky conversations are just going to set you up for success on the back end. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to McLean to start walking you through the process of setting up and developing your scenarios.
Yeah, thank you, Karli. So first, we put together 3 kind of overarching scenarios. These are based on the McKinsey model that was released a month or so ago, but we tailored these scenarios to associations. Basically, the first scenario assumes a quick recovery after Q2, while the second assumes some lingering effects into Q3, but a turnaround by the end of the year. And then the third scenario assumes lingering effects from the virus through the rest of 2020 and potentially into 2021. So the idea with this slide is to give you a framework for creating your own more specific scenarios that might apply to your association depending on how the virus unfolds. And these scenarios really represent a wide spectrum. At this point, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but as time goes on, the spectrum will narrow and your scenario should narrow accordingly. So really with this type of scenario planning, the idea is to kind of prepare for the worst and then to be relieved when that scenario doesn't come to fruition. You know, really the thing that you should not do is just adopt a wait and see approach and then be caught unprepared, you know, no matter what happens with the course of the virus. Okay, so we created some guiding principles for you to consider when you're putting together your financial model, and we'll go through more specific steps in a moment, but these are kind of the overarching ideas to keep in mind as you go about the process of building the model. So first here is to allocate your programmatic revenue and expenses. This is really the foundation of your model because you need to understand exactly how your bottom line will be impacted if an event is canceled or membership drops or there's some sort of other effect on your product lines. It's also really important here to, we'll note, to understand your fixed versus variable costs because when you're projecting membership or attendance declines, you really need to understand the revenue contributed by one attendee or one member, and you also really need to understand the cost that's contributed to that by that same one attendee or member. Identify trigger points, so start with the high-level scenarios that we presented, and then again, tailor them to your association. So the idea is to identify trigger points within your association specifically that will necessitate expense reductions. Set a target. This is a really important step. So what is your goal for this year now? Is it to break even, or are you planning to dip into your reserves? If you are planning to tap your reserves, by how much, and when would you consider actually making that decision? Finally, prioritize action steps. So identify a set of expense reduction strategies that you can then layer on to your model and align them with your financial goals to arrive at a bottom line that's going to be acceptable for you this year. Okay, so here we go step by step in building your model. This is step one. So we've just kind of created an example here of how the virus could impact an association. We can call it association ABC. But essentially what this slide does is it takes the three scenarios that we reviewed a couple slides back and applies them very, or more specifically to this association's major product lines. You can see the product lines here on the left-hand side, and then as you move from left to right, you can see how the association's product lines would be affected under each scenario. So for example, in scenario A, this is the best case scenario, there might be a Q2 softening of membership revenue, perhaps, but in scenario C, the worst case scenario, revenue would continue to decline through Q4. And you can see that under all of these scenarios, if you go to the annual meeting line, we're assuming that the annual meeting is canceled, but maybe in scenario B and C, this particular association can't recoup some of the expenses that were incurred. Also, if you go down to the advocacy line here, this is an important consideration. So your members are likely going to need more from you at this time, but how much more and for how long? And you can kind of see how that changes from scenario A to scenario C. We want to acknowledge too that we understand that this is a difficult exercise. This isn't a science. These are assumptions, and you really have to make educated guesses. Obviously, no one has a crystal ball, but again, this is about preparation and thinking through how each of your product lines could be affected, again, under kind of a best case, most likely, and worst case scenario. When you think about how to make these assumptions, some of the resources that might be available to you are obviously your colleagues, but you know, any connections you might have at other associations could be helpful. Industry resources, you can even tap your members. For membership numbers specifically, it might be helpful to think about what happened during the last recession. That could be a helpful guidepost in thinking about how your membership could potentially be reduced. Again, the idea is to start broad, but then as the virus unfolds and as you get more data on how these revenue streams could be impacted, you can update your assumptions and projections. This is definitely a living model, and it's not going to be static. Okay, here we have the second step. So this is where you take the assumptions that we just went over on all of your major product lines, and you actually translate that into numbers. So we've taken each scenario and actually applied the net income impact to each product line. You can see the total net income impact in the far right column here. You can see that obviously scenario A's impact is much more optimistic than scenario C. Again, it's really important to understand your revenue and expenses because you want to be able to project how net income is impacted and not just your revenue streams. We also think it's helpful, you'll notice here that we broke everything up by quarter, so quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. We think this is helpful in forecasting. It makes it seem a little less intimidating because you really might have a pretty good understanding at this point of what will happen in Q2, but maybe not in Q3 or Q4. And that's okay. Again, the idea is to narrow your assumptions and projections as you get more data. So, for example, once we get into Q3, if you do find that one of your other meetings, this other meetings service line here that's in each of these scenarios, if you find that you do have to cancel another meeting, obviously you should update those numbers accordingly. This is, again, a living model and not something that's designed to be static. Okay, let's move on to step 3. So this is the step where you really identify cost reduction strategies. And again, this is built from an example association, but we've broken these strategies out by levels based on how drastic the measures are. So level 1 reduction strategies, these should really feel manageable. These are kind of small measures you can take to potentially reduce your expenses. But once you get into these level 3 measures, these might feel much more disruptive to your business. So once you've outlined these cost reduction strategies and then their potential expense savings, that's when you're ready to move to the final step in this model building. And here we've mapped out how each scenario would be impacted with each level of expense reduction options. So if we look at scenario A, that's kind of the top group in this light blue shading, we would likely be fine just implementing level 1 measures, but it's important to understand your goal because that's going to dictate which of the 3 outcomes you can tolerate, and then in turn, which set of expense contingencies you should implement. So again, if we look at this scenario A, we've highlighted here in green that if you implemented some of level 2 contingencies, you would be back in the black, but just with level 1, this particular organization would be about break even at a loss of $35,000. So again, whatever your goal is going to dictate, which of these outcomes you should potentially pursue. But if we look at scenario B here, this is the yellow shading. You can see that by implementing all of level 2 expense reduction scenarios, that gets you to break even net income. And then finally, scenario C, which again is the worst case, if we implemented all of level 2 contingencies, you'd still be in the red, but by implementing level 3, you get back into the black. So again, you're probably fine implementing just some of level 3 contingencies, but again, it's up to whatever the goal that you've kind of laid out ahead of time to determine which of these 3 options you find to be tolerable. And it's important to note here that really the idea is not to say, well, I want to be prepared for scenario C, so we should go ahead and implement all level 2 contingencies. Remember your trigger points. So the idea is to respond to the current climate, but then have a plan for what if things get worse. So you're kind of implementing these expense reductions in in response to what is actually happening in real time. So you start with level 1, and then if needed, you move on to level 2 and level 3. Again, based on how, what your tolerance is for risk and where you want to end up, once we get through the end of the year. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Karli to go through some tips and action items.
Great, thanks, McLean. So just to kind of give you all some suggestions as you're thinking about how you can apply this type of process and this type of work to your own organizations, we wanted to share some tips with you that we have found to be successful with other clients that we've worked with. So the first one, empower your staff to identify areas that could be cut in the short term. If you think back to step 3 in McLean's process was kind of mapping out those options for expense reductions, we would encourage you to think about ways in which you can really include your staff in developing that list of options and those ideas for how you might cut costs. And there are a couple key reasons why we would suggest that. First is really just kind of a human element to recognize that your staff, depending on your industry and the state of your organization right now, they may be experiencing some anxiety, they may be experiencing a lot of anxiety. So giving them, in any way that you can empower them to be a part of the solution and help them figure out how you're going to get through this together as an organization, that's going to give them some control in a time when, we obviously all feel a little bit out of control about kind of what the future holds. So try and empower your staff as much as you can to help you find those cost-cutting options. The other benefit of that is that your staff will likely see options that you or the rest of your leadership team may have overlooked. They're thinking about things in their day-to-day work that you may not have as much exposure to. So different processes, different systems, different vendors. So there's also kind of a practical benefit in just kind of getting a different set of eyes on the problem to help you come up with those ideas. Related to that, we would also encourage you to think about where in your organization you might have some excess staff capacity right now, or you may have in the coming months, and really try and capitalize on that capacity to accelerate some innovation for the future. So, we obviously don't want your staff kind of just sitting and being anxious about what the future holds for them. So if you can redirect them into envisioning what your association can look like on the back end of this, and really get them motivated to innovate new programs or services or new ways to serve your members, there's going to be kind of a double benefit to that as well. Secondly, we really recommend arming your leadership team with information in this process. So they need to understand these scenarios, and they need to understand the implications of these scenarios. So they will likely be responsible for making some of these decisions included in your kind of contingency plans. They're also going to be responsible for operationalizing these changes. So they really need to feel kind of bought in and understanding what those assumptions are and following the logic of how we got from point A to point B, so that they can lead their team and they can manage with confidence. Related to this, we would also encourage you to try and find a way to be as transparent as possible with your staff at large. So you may not be sharing kind of the full contingency plan with all of the numbers and all of the steps and all of the assumptions, but we would encourage you to communicate with them about kind of where your organization is, what the next steps might be, what they should be prepared for. We've learned in this process that transparency is really everything. So even if people are feeling anxious about what lies ahead, knowing that their organization and their leadership is at least communicating with them in an authentic way is going to make them feel more comfortable as you navigate this together. A couple other kind of more tactical recommendations here. So if you are considering a reduction in force or a furlough program, which I know a lot of organizations are right now, be sure that when you are building your financial contingencies, you are considering kind of the ancillary costs around that are not just salary. So depending on kind of how your health insurance is structured, whether you have a severance program, how your 401k contributions are structured, there may be other financial commitments that you will be on the hook for, even if you move forward with a furlough program or a reduction in force, that may significantly limit your ability to cut costs immediately. So just be really careful that you're understanding the structures, talk with your benefits provider, talk with your 401k provider before you make any assumptions around what a furlough or reduction in force program might look like in terms of expense reduction. Next, we've talked a lot about kind of the expense side of the equation here, which is understandable. We're all focused on kind of cutting costs wherever we can right now, but don't let that make you miss out on kind of the revenue side of the equation. So think about not just how you can reduce your expense equation, but how you can increase your revenue to shore up some of the shortfalls that you may be experiencing. Obviously, there's been a lot of publicity and press around kind of the SBA loans that are available, the PPP program that came out of the CARES Act legislation. So there are some resources available to nonprofit organizations, to small businesses. So make sure that you are exploring all avenues there. We obviously are not experts in these areas, but if you are looking for more resources, we can definitely connect you with some of our partner organizations that can help you navigate those. Also, be on the lookout for ways that you could actually deliver new programs and services in this time. So back to the point about using this time for innovation, are there new ways that you can deliver value to your members to, again, help shore up your revenue shortfalls? And finally, depending on your industry, depending on your organization and its bylaws, you may have the opportunity to do member assessments to shore up some of that revenue shortfall as well, if that's something that is appropriate for your organization. And finally, just a kind of closing reminder to make sure that you are meeting your members where they are. So depending on what industry you're in, depending on kind of what segment you serve and the day-to-day lives of the professionals in your organization, they're going to be experiencing a really kind of wide range of situations right now. Their environment is looking really different than they're used to. And so that may mean that you need to communicate that with them differently. You need to reach out to them differently. You may need to be saying different things to make sure that you're getting across and make sure they're seeing the value in your organization. So if you serve an industry that's experiencing really significant layoffs right now, for example, can you lead with any career resources that you have, a job bank, a mentorship program, things that are really timely and relevant to your members right now. Similarly, if your members are required to maintain credentials or licensure during this time, what can you do to make sure that your CE and CEUs are as accessible as possible? So again, just realizing that reaching out to your members and connecting with your members may require some different strategies and different approaches. And so what can you do to kind of, again, meet them where they are? We really feel like the organizations that are able to innovate and communicate effectively during this time are just going to be that much better positioned on the back end to come out strong and be ready to continue to show their members the value that they provide. So with that, we'd like to close up. Our contact information is here on our final slide. Please feel free to reach out to me or McLean if you have any questions or want some more information about kind of this process or any of the things that we talked about today. We're also happy to help your organization navigate this together if you'd like some help in doing that. So thank you again for your time and take care.